So before, I have a lot of questions about this book. But before that, I would love for you to read from the book, you know.
Okay. I'll just give you a quick taste so you have an idea of how it sounds. Because the thing is, the story is not told by these brothers. The story is told by Bartholomew, who is this orphan from Bombay, who, is really into museums, but has his own way of looking at things. So I'll just read the first few paragraphs so you get an idea of how he thinks and talks and acts. My name is Bartholomew. Oh, and I should say sorry for my German accent. I mean, I for a long time, before I met my wife, who's from India, I thought I don't have an accent. I thought like I have a very good, English. And after a while, she told me, no, you sound quite German. I was like, no, do I really? And then I found out at some point. My name is Bartholomew. I am at least 12 years old, and today, on 20th October 1854, I have founded India's first museum. I call it the Museum of the World. Smitaben says it should be called the Museum of Wretchedness, but what does a cook from Gujarat really know about such things? I do not want to write anything bad about her, even if she cannot read, but time and again she surprises me with how little she understands in more than one regard. After over 10 years in Bombay, she can barely speak a word of Marathi or Hindi. Without my help, no one in the glass house would know what she has cooked for us, and Smitaben would not be able to tell what the sabzi wala, what vegetables she needs. When he arrives with his cart in front of our gate early in the morning, she has long been up and about cleaning one of the many windows that give St. Helena its sobriquet. Smitaben is always the first to get up, and I am not sure whether she sleeps at all. In the evenings, when the lights are put out in the dormitories, we can hear her downstairs in the kitchen scrubbing the pots and chasing the cockroaches. She does not have a family, at any rate, not a real one. All the orphans call her Masi. Her hair is white, not grey like that of other Masis, but white, like the dough of the Portuguese pão that she sometimes bakes for us. Smitaben knows a thing or two about taste. I prefer her salty, sweet handvo to all of Bombay's dishes. Unfortunately, her other senses are not as well developed. She has spent so much of her life looking at ordinary things that she does not see what is remarkable. How silly of me not to have thought of that. Smitaben's reaction to India's first museum matched her rustic nature. She gave me a smack on the back of my head, which did not hurt, and disappeared again into her territory, the kitchen. I think that gives an
Thank you,
impression.
Christopher. Smitaben was a warm hug in this book, and all the characters are so beautiful. But I'll go to Bartholomew first, because that's the POV character. And I remember when I mailed you, the first mail that I sent you about the book, I had just finished the first chapter, and I said I already want to adopt Bartholomew. But now that I've finished the book, he doesn't really need any saving, does he?
Yeah.
So where did this character, come to your mind? How did you create him? What inspired you?
Well, that's hard to answer because I'm not so sure quite myself. Maybe I should point out that most of what is in that book, like most of the characters and most of the things that happen, even some days when it rains, that's, according to the documents, that's actually what happened back then. So it's heavily based on a lot of research, but the most fictional part about it is definitely Bartholomew. And he, I guess for me, it was important how to get into that story. Who is the one, whose perspective are we going to choose? And I didn't want to write another novel where it's like, okay, so there's this guy from Germany who writes about these Germans who came to India, and then they have this magnifying glass, and then they look at a different place in the world and they say, how strange, how exotic, or whatever. So that has been done a lot in the past, and like even 100 years ago we would have had a lot of literature like that already. So I was more interested in so what is the new thing that we know much more now about that time and what happened and how we can look at those things. And so I was looking for something to break that narrative a little bit, and so I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to have someone who turns the whole thing around on who actually looks at those scientists and turns them into objects. And that's literally what he does in the book. I mean, the chapters are not really chapters, they're objects. He's collecting all these objects through India, and most of the objects he collects are actually those brothers. So sometimes a chapter is just about these brothers, and he looks at them and he tries to analyze them and see, like, you know, who are you guys? Who are you to come here and, you know, tell people what that mountain and what it should be named like, and how that river should be named, and how things are working? Why don't we, you know, look at you, analyze you, and objectify you? And I think I felt like that a younger voice and a more daring young person would be more interesting to tell that. Also, at the same point, or at the same time, I wanted to have someone telling the story who is traveling with these brothers, because, you know, that time it was a big adventure, even for these Germans. It was, of course, a big thing to travel for 3 years and go up and down the Himalayas and all kinds of things. But it was still as comfortable as possible in their time for them. You know, if there was a building or anything nearby, they would be sleeping under a roof, whereas everyone else in that journey who would be carrying things and translating and doing all the tough work, they wouldn't. So I felt like I wanted to tell this whole expedition story from the point of perspective of someone who is like much lower in the hierarchy.
Right. So the Schlagentweit brothers, they're the historical part of the story, the true part of the story. And why did you think that would be the perfect story to tell the story of colonialism, the British occupation in India in the 1850s?
Well, I mean, for that I have to explain how the situation is in Germany. So in Germany for a long time now, we have not really been dealing with colonialism or talking about it so much. Because of course we were kind of focused on 2 other things, you know, that happened after that in Germany. So like a lot of research and a lot of like working on history and like building memorials and museums and talking with, there's like a lot of GDR and of course the Third Reich and Nazis and the Holocaust. So most of the focus has been on that for a long time, and only now it's almost like, you know, you take away layer and after layer, and now we come to that period and more people start talking about it, because for a long time, you know, like there might be quite a lot of Germans you might meet in the street and you ask them about colonialism and they'll be like, yeah, but I know the British and the Spanish and the Belgians, but they're not the Germans because we didn't have colonies. Like a lot of them would think that. And so there's this one thing that we had colonies. We didn't have them for that long, but you can still do a lot of damage, as we've proven, while having colonies, although not so much in Asia. It's more mostly Africa. And so there were colonies. They were taken away from Germany after the First World War, which is probably a good thing. But then even if people know about it, they don't know what happened and or what relation most of these colonies were to Germany back then or even today. So if you don't even know that, then it's even less people talk about the whole involvement of scientists and science in general, how much it was involved in colonialism. Because, for example, the 19th century is still a time that is mostly perceived in Germany as like, you know, those were still the good times. We were like still the poets and the thinkers. And it's like a great culture, and that's why people like buildings from that time. If they rebuild buildings from that time, everybody's like, yeah, that's great. But if you build a little bit later, then it's like, oh, I don't know what happened. We had these 2 blips in history, kind of like, oh, First World War, oh, Second World War, but now we're back and it's good and nothing ever happened. So with that background, it's of course wrong, because there has been an involvement and a movement leading up to all the problems in the 20th century, and that already started in the 19th century with Germany really trying to have colonies as well. They really wanted to do the same thing. I mean, the Kaiser Wilhelm, like he was driving the state to, like, he really wanted to be like the English basically, and so they were not only on a state level involved, but they also were involved very much on like a scientific level. And that's one of the typical stories. One of the most famous scientists from the 19th century in Germany is Alexander von Humboldt. And he, thanks to the Spanish crown, traveled widely in South America. And he documented a lot of the terrible things that were done there. And the Spanish crown was not happy about that. So but still, he was also involved in it because he was paid by them, and so he could only do his research thanks to the crown. So it's a bit problematic, of course, like who is giving you the money, and then again it's also the question, what do they use that knowledge for? Like if you gather all that knowledge in that time, you were like the scientists, those pioneers, those expeditioners, they were like Google, you know, they gather all the knowledge and then they come back home, and who gets to get or have all that knowledge? Someone like the East India, something like the East India Company, and they use that knowledge and they say like, oh great, so now we know about this region, how much it rains every year, and who lives there, and who's the Maharaja, and does he have a son or a daughter or not, and how do things work in that, and how do you quickly approach that country, and you know how their relations. So, and if you know all that, it's very easy to exploit a people, and that's how scientists were actually quite a bit involved, and that's what I found so interesting about these Schlagenweits, that they thought they were doing a good thing, you know, but at the same time, who were they gathering all that knowledge for?
Right. Now, here's a question about the craft. You know, I'm a reader, but I'm very curious about the process of writing. And when I read historical fiction, I always wonder, you know, you're taking a historically true account as a sort of skeleton, and then you're weaving a fictional story around it. So is it easier or is it harder, because you can't just take the story wherever you want to take it?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I personally believe, you know, like even if you decide to write non-fiction, you'll, to a certain extent, you know, you always write your fiction, because you always choose a certain, you know, perspective on things. You want to say a certain thing. You want to drive the story to a certain point. You choose to leave out things because you can never tell everything. So in a way, everything you will tell, once you open your mouth and once you start typing, you fictionalize things, you know, like even scientists do that in a certain sense, that they focus on certain things and they can't count everything in. So, and in that respect, I also felt like that, of course, I have all the freedom in the world on one hand, but on the other hand, I'm strictly limited. And I've, like, personally for this book, it felt actually easier for me, because I had all these limitations, and I felt like that was actually better for me, because if, you know, sometimes I just feel like if writing the next book is, like, if there's too much freedom, you know, then you can do anything at any point, and that can be rather confusing. Whereas I felt like, okay, I know they traveled for 3 years, you know, like, this and that will happen, and at that point they will be in this place, and that's what I did, and I can't just come with anything. I will always have to find a way to tell the story and just still be as close as possible to the truth. But, you know, I get to lie, of course, all the time, but as long as I tell something truthful, that's fine. I personally preferred it. I expected otherwise. I expected, oh God, it's like history, and it's in a, you know, it has to do with India, so I know that, of course, less than I know Germany. So I thought it would be much more problematic and I would need much more help, but it ended up actually not being that difficult, and I think that was thanks to Bartholomew greatly, because he really pulled me through the story.
How wonderful. Now, at one point, Bartholomew says that, being an Indo-European, I doubt whether I'm the right person to create a museum for India. Clearly, you had similar thoughts as a writer when you were writing this story.
Well, I would not say I'm an Indo-European, I guess, but
Honorary Indian.
yeah, honorary Indian. Yes, I have an OCI. That's like, I used to prefer the, you know, before I got the UCI, they still had the PIO, and that's when I applied for it, which I found more appealing in terms of like what it means, because then I would always go back to that little village I grew up in Bavaria, and I would say like, look, I'm a person of Indian origin, did you know? And most people are like, you're a person of Indian origin? You know, so overseas citizenship just sounds more official now. Yeah, so that was a very important aspect about the whole book, because that's all what Bartholomew is about. Like, his biggest conflict in the whole story is that in the beginning he thinks his worldview is very clear, and he knows who's bad and who's good, and he knows, like, I'm Indian and those are the bad colonizers, and that's that. And then the more the story evolves, the more he has to also, it's like kind of a coming of age story for him, because he more and more realizes that part of him already has been greatly colonized. He just he's not aware of that, or he wasn't aware of it. I mean, like, for starters, his name is Bartholomew, and he writes a story in German. I mean, in the translation, of course, it's in English, but he writes it in German because he thinks German is like a great scientist language. But like, who taught him that, and who gave him the idea that the great scientists are actually speaking German and not Hindi? So, so of course he is already colonized, and he realizes that about himself, that he can't tear himself like into, you know, two different people. And so, yeah, he realizes also the story happening in, you know, 1854 to 1857, and at the very end of the story, of course, that's a very problematic time for not, you know, knowing if you're on that or that side. He realizes that he has to make a decision on what side he will be on.
So choosing sides is actually a very important theme. You know, he can't decide who is he and which side is he on. Are there any other themes like this that you wanted to touch upon when you were telling this story?
Well, it's just something that I like always encounter. I mean, like I encounter in my life. I have these conversations basically on an everyday basis with my wife. You just like, you know, you compare things and how you see things and how you realize that, you know, you're brought up in your own cultural environment and with your own perspective, and you there's like even the most banal and simple things in life you think like that's clear, like that's a simple truth, and then if someone comes along and questions it, and that can be something very, like even just like the temperature, you know, like I mean when my wife and I, when we leave the house in Berlin, it can happen that she'd be like, oh, it's quite cold today, and I'd be like, it's like it's really warm today, I think, you know, and then we can't even agree on like what warm and cold means, and we can go on and on about this and talk about food and things, and those are just like the very banal things about everyday life. So if we go even deeper with things, then it gets even more complicated, and I think that's something that I've actually learned a lot by or through living here and staying in India a lot, or like having a lot of friends and family from here, and doing that now for almost like 12 years, that a lot of my perspectives have been like turned around, or like at least have been a little bit more balanced, you know. Like the very first time I came here, I went to a cafe and there was this world map on the wall, and I looked at it and I was like very arrogantly was like, oh, being the German I am, you're like, oh, look, that Indian world map, it's distorted, it's something is wrong about it. Until I realized that they just had put like South Asia in the center, and you know, Europe was like squished up in the northwest somewhere, and it looked like it was the least important part of the world. And I was like, that just can't be right, you know. And that's exactly what happened to me all the time. Like, and also in the respective sense, and not only that I of course learn more about India and whatever. That's not even the main priority. My main priority is that every time I'm coming back to Germany, I realize more and more now that I think actually one of the most exotic places you can visit nowadays on this planet is actually Germany. And this country is not the exotic place, this is the exotic place. And I come there and I realize that a lot of things are really strange about Germany, how things work, and I think they're more the weird ones often than anyone else. I mean, I always try to explain it with the zebra crossing, you know, like the whole world. I think most countries probably have zebra crossings, and you know, in most countries it doesn't matter, you know, because nobody cares about zebra crossings, or the cars are always like the priority, and Germans, the people are not. Whereas I think you come to Germany, and like in 9 out of 10 cases, you'll be like, you know, you can step on the zebra crossing, the cars will stop, and you can do that game again and again, and it will actually work. I mean, 9 out of 10 times. And what it tells me is always like the Germans really like their rules, you know, they really like the rule is probably the more important thing than anything else sometimes, in comparison to other places where it's more like you have to be a bit more flexible.
Now, I'm a fan of footnotes in fiction, and my favorite being Susanna Clarke's Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. And I found the footnotes in the Museum of the World equally entertaining. Is this something you put in all of your fiction, this little touch of whimsy?
No, that was definitely only in this book, and it definitely had to do with the fact that he wants to create this museum of India. He wants to collect all things that are Indian, and so he wants to give India its first museum in that time. And that's why he has this scientific idea or scientific approach. Whereas it's very important to point out that all his footnotes often explain things that he thinks things should be explained to an Indian audience. So we have a lot of things, I mean, it was written for Germans, so there are a lot of things in there where Germans think like, I know that, I don't need an explanation for that, but he is explaining it from his Indian perspective, and he has a very, very different view on things, obviously. And it also was important for me because one of the most common things that people approach me with after readings or Germany in general with the book was like, why is there no glossary? Like, nobody explains me all these words that I don't know, you know, like I think there are like 300 words or something in there that are most Germans will not know, and I mean, Handwo would be one of them, I guess. And like when the book came out as an audiobook, the actor called and he asked me, he's like, oh, so there are all these words, I don't know how to pronounce them. And I said, like, well, I often also don't know how to pronounce them. So like, I asked my wife, we made this audio recording, and she was like, and I gave her the list, and she's like, read very quickly all these 300 words. So the actor would know how to more or less pronounce them. And the weird thing is, of course, we have in Germany this idea, oh, there are words I don't know, from where? From India? Okay, so you need to explain them to me. Whereas like if, of course, let's say, here a book comes out here from the US, it could be from the tiniest backwater town, you know, you would never ask anyone for glossary because it's kind of expected that we know certain things, of course, about the certain parts of the world. So that is okay, but the other way around, it's like, no, you have to explain it to me because why should I know? And it's true. I mean, I realized for a long time growing up that I don't think I had 1 hour of history. I mean, maybe I was not there that day in school, but I don't think I had 1 hour of history about all of Asia. It's just like, imagine like all of Asia and like thousands of years of history, and I like maybe 45 minutes in 13 years of school. And that tells you a lot, but I've learned very like precisely how like the Senate works and how the parties, and like I know a lot about like the US, and that history is not even that old. I mean, if you consider the new history, I guess.
So my favorite footnote is obviously the one where you're translating a word. Bartholomew is translating a word in the footnotes. I don't remember the word, but the translation says it's the word for pagal. Thank you, Christopher. I have many more questions because this is such a layered book, but I would like the audience to get a chance to ask you questions about the book. If anybody has some questions.
Do you?
Christopher, when you're dealing with a record, there is an actual tangible record. How much freedom do you have to play with that record? Or were you very faithful to the record and unfaithful with Bartholomew and other characters like that?
Well, I made consciously the decision that I said, of course, like, first I have to look at what I'm writing. I'm not a historian. I'm not going to write like a thesis or something. If I would be writing a thesis, I would know what the hierarchy would look like. But like in this case, I was like, okay, I'm writing a novel. So obviously for me, the hierarchy was, first of all, is the storytelling part. So I'm not, there's sometimes with historical fiction, there's sometimes books when you read them and you feel like, oh, you dug up that story or you dug up that fact about that time and you really liked it and it's a really great fact, but it doesn't have anything to do with the story. If you would take it out, the story would still work, and I think that's always a bad, or a good sign in that sense, that it shows you that maybe it doesn't have to be in there. I mean, there's a lot of historical fiction where I feel like, where I read it and I'm like, oh, great, interesting, but does it have to do anything, does it organically work with the story? And there was a lot like that where I was like, sadly, it was like, no, I guess I have to take that out. And sometimes I could put it in where it's like, oh, great, because this guy really likes rum, and Old Monk was just introduced in a year when they came to India. It was just introduced to the market, so I was happy that those things work together. But if they hadn't been drinking, or just to mention at one line, I'm like, and by the way, there's Old Monk, I was like, wise, So I felt like that's the priority. And then the next thing has, of course, there's a certain, I have to be I have a certain obligation and a responsibility, which is very hard to define. But I feel like if you telling something, especially historical, and especially in my context, like coming from like a country like Germany that was a colonializer country, that of course there's a certain responsibility I have to tell. Like, I mean, like I'm not gonna write a book and say like, you know, it wasn't all that bad. You know, then I would feel like I didn't live up to the responsibility.
Thank you. You and Jerry have this thing in common, two things in common between both your books. They're both about orphans, and both the books mention Lord Elphinstone. Any other questions?
Interesting.
Thank you. Thank you, Christopher.
Thank you
And
so much.
over to you, Adrian.
Thank you.